You've already heard about the colonies of Britain, Netherlands, Spain and Portugal, but what about the German colony with the sole purpose of finding a golden city, a Swedish settlement in the middle of the United States in what is now Delaware, Japan's northern island where they flat out removed the majority of the people who lived there, and arguably the oldest colony of all time, dating back thousands of years, the island of Madagascar. These are the strangest colonies and the unknown stories behind them. When we think of colonization, we often think of global powers taking control of an area far away on another continent to extract resources and riches. We also imagine that these colonies are distinct from its occupier nation, and that it eventually becomes independent. But this isn't always the case. Japan is often viewed as a homogeneous group of islands, made up of the Japanese Yamato people, but taking a look at the northern island of Hokkaido, we find out that this could not be further from the truth. Hokkaido, as well as the smaller surrounding islands, have been occupied by people completely unrelated to the Yamato, with a separate language and culture known as the Ainu. They arrived way before the mainstream Japanese Yamato people. The Ainu culture is more closely related to the ones of Siberia and Alaska than of Japan, a hunting culture. The Ainu had a close connection to nature, eating mostly animals such as fish, bear, foxes and wolves. In addition to this, the Ainu worship animal deities, believing every part of nature has a god, or kamui, attached to it. For example, the deity Kim-un Kamui is worshipped as the god of bears and mountains. The Ainu traditionally live in villages, with each village being close-knit and acting as a unit. While the Yamato people took control over the southern islands quite quickly, the cold and remote island of Hokkaido was mostly left alone during early Japanese history. Contact between the two peoples grew over time, with the Japanese controlling the southern part of the island, as well as trading with the Ainu. Whilst there were a few revolts in the Japanese-controlled parts of Ainu territory, the relationship was mostly peaceful, with the increased trade leading to a greater understanding and acceptance of the other from both sides. Unfortunately for the Ainu, at the start of the 18th century, the shogun of Japan took direct control of the southern part of Hokkaido, with the goal of increasing the Japanese population there. To achieve this, Ainu men were forcibly deported, while Ainu women were subjected to forced marriages to Japanese men. These factors, combined with the influx of smallpox, reduced the Ainu population from 80,000 to 15,000 in the span of just 60 years. Things only worsened for the Ainu during the Meiji Restoration, where Japan came under the rule of a nationalistic regime that wanted to industrialize and create national unity across all of the Japanese islands. They achieved this by taking control of the entirety of Hokkaido and distributing land over the island to Japanese colonizers. Since the Japanese viewed the Ainu culture as barbaric, colonization resulted in a large part of Ainu culture being wiped out or becoming assimilated with Japanese culture. This was exacerbated by the fact that many Ainu married Japanese partners to save their children from discrimination. While the island of today boasts a population of over 5 million, the Ainu make up just a fraction of that, with around 16,000 Ainu keeping their culture and history alive. China is not a country that is known for colonization or exploration. In fact, they're mostly known for being isolationist, not wanting anything to do with the outside world. The first Ming emperor was quoted as saying, "Overseas, foreign countries are separated from us by mountains and seas and far away in a corner. Their lands would not produce enough for us to maintain them. Their people would not usefully serve us if incorporated." However, China has engaged in colonialism, and all they needed was a little push from the Europeans. Taiwan was, for most of its history, an irrelevant backwater. It was inhabited by various indigenous peoples who focused mostly on subsistence farming and was not perceived to have a wealth of natural resources or a strategically important location. But this all changed when the Europeans, and more specifically the Dutch, arrived. The Dutch had trading ports in modern-day Indonesia, but wanted to expand into the Chinese market. Unfortunately, the Dutch had arrived late to the party. The Portuguese had already taken control of Macau, and neither they or the Chinese were interested in helping the Dutch, leaving them empty-handed on the Chinese mainland. But the Dutch did not give up easily, and instead decided to establish their base of operations on the relatively unexplored island of Taiwan. At first glance, the island was useful as a trading hub and port, but the Dutch had bigger ambitions. They wanted to use the island to produce sugar and other crops, which they could then use to trade with the Chinese. But they found the indigenous populations unwilling to grow cash crops, with them being mostly content making just enough for themselves to survive. Therefore, the Dutch had to get creative. Since the people on the island were useless to them, they decided to import farmers who shared their goals. The Dutch set up a system where Chinese immigrants could come and receive free land, lower taxes than the mainland, as well as being defended from attacks from aboriginals or others. This made Taiwan the perfect place for both rich, who wanted lower taxes, and poor, who could receive their own plot of farmland. This system worked wonders, and after just 30 years, roughly 50,000 Chinese settlers had arrived on Taiwan. But the system the Dutch had created could not last forever. The Chinese living on the island had had most of their profits taken by the Dutch, and it was only a matter of time until the situation on Taiwan became unsustainable for them. That moment came during the fall of the Chinese Ming dynasty, where a general fighting for the Ming seized the island to use as a military base, forcing the Dutch out and ending their roughly 30 years of rule on the island. This left the island of Taiwan with a majority Chinese population, and shortly after it was annexed by incorporating the newly formed Qing dynasty. When thinking of colonial powers, the first one that comes to most people's minds is England. After all, they colonized the United States, and after uniting with Scotland to become the United Kingdom, they managed to control a quarter of the world's total land area. But what you might not know is that the union between England and Scotland was created off the back of a failed Scottish colony. It's the 17th century, and Scotland is jealous of its southern neighbour's colonial success. Scotland had always been an agricultural economy, but crop failures and unusually low temperatures had caused economic stagnation for the Scots. The English, however, were using their colonies to create a vast trade empire, growing insanely rich as a result of it. The struggling Scots saw their arch enemies rolling in colonial dough, and decided that they deserved a slice of the pie. The best way to do that? Rip off the English strategy. Thus, the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies was created in 1695 with the goal of, you guessed it, trading in Africa, India and the Americas. Investment in the company poured in from all over Scotland, eventually reaching their goal of £400,000. This was an enormous amount of money at the time, totaling around a fifth of all the wealth in Scotland. Once the money was raised, however, a major problem arose. What should they do with it? Since the Scottish were so late to the colonial party, other, larger powers such as England and the Netherlands had already taken control of most of the ports and shipping lanes across Africa on the way to India. And since Scotland did not have the naval might to wrest control of these routes, another plan had to be hatched. Enter William Paterson, a well-known Scottish banker and trader. Paterson had grown rich from the slave trade in the West Indies and was therefore a well-respected voice in the Scottish company. Paterson suggested that Scotland use its funds to colonize the Darien Gap, located in modern-day Panama. Paterson promised that the soil and climate of the region were perfect for the Scots, as well as opening up possibilities to drag their ships across the gap into the Pacific Ocean, giving them access to the Indian Sea. The Scottish company agreed with this, and in 1698 set sail to found their own colony. Unfortunately for the Scots, things went wrong almost as soon as they landed. The climate was extremely hot and humid, the soil could not support the Scottish crops, and diseases ran rampant in the colony. But the biggest problem was the location of the Darien Gap. In the middle of the Spaniards' domain in America, the lands had been untouched by the Spaniards as it was deemed uninhabitable. But they still didn't like Scottish pilgrims setting up camp in the middle of their territory. Therefore, the Spanish fleet blockaded the settlers, with only a few survivors making it back to Scotland. Another colonization attempt was tried the next year, with about the same amount of success as the first. This disaster destroyed the Scottish economy, forcing them into a union with England. Usually, colonization occurs when a more powerful and larger state takes control of a weaker one. But this is not always the case. The biggest example of this is the tiny German city-state of Augsburg, and their colony of Klein-Venedig. The leader of Augsburg at this time was Bartholomeus Wölser. He had earned this title by being an incredibly successful banker, and had managed to climb the ladder by having powerful men be in his debt. One of these men was the Holy Roman Emperor, who also happened to be the King of Spain. Since his realm was low on funds at the time, the emperor chose to repay Welser with the newly discovered province of Venezuela, under the condition that Welser conquered and developed the region at his own expense. This was a big risk for Welser, but also had massive potential upside, since the province was believed to contain the greatest prize in the New World, El Dorado. Welser assembled a fleet, manned them with 300 settlers, appointed conquistador Ambrosius Enger to become the first governor of Klein Venedig, and ordered him to find the lost city of gold. Enger immediately began searching deep into the jungles of Venezuela with around 150 men. But the German settlers were not used to the weather or terrain of the Amazon, which, together with resistance from the native tribes, was incredibly fierce. And Enger died in the Amazon rainforest to a poisoned arrow and a temporary halt to the German operations there. But the German quest to find El Dorado on their colonial lands did not stop there. After Enger came two other German conquistadors, George von Speyer and Philipp von Hutten, who would continue the search for the City of Gold. They scoured the Amazon for a combined total of 10 years, searching deeper and deeper into the treacherous jungles for every passing year, feeling themselves coming closer and closer. But what neither of them knew was that the whole thing was a facade. There never existed a City of Gold in the Amazon, and the natives knew it. But they were tired of European colonizers ravaging their lands, and therefore played into their belief of El Dorado, leading them deep into the jungle, telling them that El Dorado was just ahead, before heading back and letting the indigenous tribes take care of the rest. Thus, Augsburg's attempt at colonialism failed massively in everything it tried to do, and they were forced to give up their lands after a mere 18 years of being a colonial power. The island of Madagascar, just off the eastern coast of Africa, may be one of the oldest colonies in the world, with people from an entirely different continent. The culture of the people of Madagascar, known as the Malagasy, have perplexed scientists for many years. While the island is just off the African east coast, the culture of the islands does not resemble any of the nearby nations, with large differences in culture and language. While many theories had been put forth, for the longest time, the origin of the Malagasy was unknown to us. This is until 8 years ago, in 2016, when archaeologist Nicole Boivin and her team made some huge discoveries on Madagascar. Boivin and her team examined ancient crop remains on the island, which revealed that ancient Madagascar had a large influx of crops not found on the African continent. These crops were instead of Austronesian origin, meaning the area around Australia and Indonesia. It would have been nearly impossible for these crops to have made this long journey without human intervention. Thus, most researchers now believe that Pacific explorers made it to Madagascar as early as 700 AD, and intermixed with the small native hunter-gatherer population. Upon further inspection, this makes sense when we look at the Malagasy culture, with them sharing a lot of linguistic and cultural similarities with a lot of people of countries such as Indonesia. There are many countries in Europe who participated in colonization, even smaller powers such as Sweden or Denmark. But one of the most interesting ones is the Latvian colonization of Tobago in the 1600s. This is additionally surprising considering that Latvia was not a country at this point in history. So how did they have a colony? Well, what is today known as the nation of Latvia was then called Courland, which was a Latvian-speaking part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But Courland did not have a significant amount of autonomy, and possessed quite a powerful navy for use in the Baltic Sea. This naval power emboldened them to try their hand at colonization. Their target, the island of Tobago, just off the coast of modern-day Venezuela. Previous attempts at colonization had been made by great colonial powers like Spain and England, but had all failed due to resistance from the natives. At first, the Latvians were just as unsuccessful as their predecessors, with their colonization attempts being repelled by the natives in both 1639 and 1642. Seeing these failures, the Latvians switched targets, managing to colonize a small part of modern-day Gambia in 1651. This meant that they now had the opportunity to get in on one of the most lucrative businesses of all time, the transatlantic slave trade, further incentivizing them to gain a colony in the Americas. This time around, they would not repeat their previous mistakes. Not only did they bring a relatively large army with them to snuff out any resistance, they did something quite uncommon during the colonial era. They gave the natives respect and special rights. This worked wonders for Courland, as they managed to settle the island fully, with its population reaching as high as 25,000, although 13,000 of those were slaves. So why does modern Tobago not show any signs of Latvian influence? Well, Courland was invaded by the Swedish Empire just a few years later in 1656, becoming annexed by the Nordic state. Because of this loss of autonomy and power, Courland was forced to cede both Tobago and its Gambian garrison to the Dutch and English respectively, ending its short reign as a colonial power. The Nordics are a region that are known for their seafaring. During the times of the Vikings, they displayed an early form of colonialism, with their reach stretching over the whole of Europe. One of the most famous examples of Viking colonization is that of Normandy, in what is modern-day France. Viking raids into coastal regions of France had begun as early as the 6th century AD, but got increasingly common and expensive during the 800s. The French, not having the manpower or unity to deal with the invaders, looked for another solution to the Viking problem. When the Viking Rollo was defeated in battle, the French king granted him land in northern France, and in exchange, Rollo swore to defend this land from his fellow Norsemen. This region became known as the region of the Northmen, or Normandy. Another fact that you may be surprised to learn is that Russia is also named after the Vikings. While the Vikings from modern-day Norway and Denmark colonized the west, the Swedish had their sights on the east. Traveling up the many rivers of Eastern Europe, these Vikings colonized large parts of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, leaving a massive cultural impact in these regions. Since these Vikings were from a region in Sweden called Roslagen, they were known as the Rus, and even though these Vikings are long gone, their legacy lives on in the names of Russia and Belarus. Speaking of Sweden, you might be surprised to learn that they themselves had a colonial past. In the 1600s, the Swedish Empire had reached the zenith of its power, and was one of the most respected and feared states in all of Europe. The Swedes used this power to attempt to colonize modern-day Delaware in the United States, declaring it to be New Sweden. But this attempt was short-lived, as the colony was annexed by the Dutch in 1654, less than 20 years after its founding. The Swedes, while having a powerful navy in the Baltic Sea, simply did not have the manpower or naval strength to compete with large naval powers. But this did not deter them, as they managed to acquire the Caribbean island of St. Bartholomew from the French in 1784. This time around, the Swedish took a unique approach to the Caribbean colony. To encourage trade on the island, the Swedes declared it a free port, as well as adopting a very progressive and liberal religious view for the time. While Sweden was a Lutheran Protestant nation, the inhabitants of St. Bartholomew were free to practice any faith they desired, as long as they were Christian, of course. This helped grow the island exponentially, helping it become an important trade hub in the Caribbean, with 20% of exports to the US traveling through the island in the early 1800s. The Swedes used the island to grow exotic fruits as well as winemaking, which was impossible in the harsh climate of Sweden. This was, however, abandoned quite quickly as the Swedes realized that they were terrible at making wine, instead deciding to get their wine from France like the rest of the world. Despite the Swedish approach producing some positive results, the island was never profitable. The Swedish king eventually grew tired of an unprofitable island on the other side of the world and thusly decided to sell it back to the French in 1878. However, Swedish influence can still be seen on the island, with the capital retaining its name of Gustavia to this day.